Før dagens hovedtaler kommer på scenen, så skal vi altså hilse på Heine Steinkopf. Han da fagleder i RVTS Sør, og han skal nå komme med en velkomsthilsen til oss. Vær så god, Heine. Scenen din.
Ja, så hyggelig å se så mange folk her. Veldig kjekt. Jeg altså Heine Steinkopf, jeg fagleder i RVTS Sør, som da regionalt ressurssenter om vold, traumatisk stress, selvmordsforebygging og migrasjonshelse, region Sør. Så for letthets skyld så kaller vi oss, vi holder på med psykologiske traumer som sånn hovedsak, og det peker oss litt imot det som tema for dagen. Da. Altså vi, som sånn kompetansesenter så vi opptatt av å bidra til at tjenestene opplever at de gjør en best mulig jobb, og at folk som bruker alle disse tjenestene opplever at de blir møtt, at de opplever at de får god hjelp. Og da vi på konstant leiting etter modeller, altså rammeverk, modeller, metaforer, hva som helst nesten, som kan bidra til at folk får bedre hjelp, folk får god hjelp. Og dermed så passer dette rammeverket også veldig fint inn i den kompetansesenter scope, altså vår interesse, vårt oppdrag og vårt mandat om å prøve å finne de best mulige modellene som bidrar til at folk får best mulig hjelp. Da. Så vi har jobbet, eller holdt på ganske lenge, for ca. 12 år siden så ble vi jo anfalt på en måte av det vi nå kaller for traumebevissthet, eller traumebevisst praksis, traumebevisst omsorg. Det jo sånn sett et rammeverk det også, som gir oss mulighet til å forstå folk ut ifra hva de har opplevd. Det gir oss muligheten til å møte mennesker i forhold til de belastningene de har hatt i livene sine. Så vi oppfatter jo at en traumebevisst omsorg, traumebevisst praksis peker nesten direkte mot dette rammeverket da, som vi skal høre litt mer om i dag. Kan vi se her også en jukselapp som faktisk står på engelsk, fordi jeg trodde at vi skulle snakke engelsk, så slapp vi jo for så vidt, det var interessant. Det sånn overraskende vanskelig å oversette tilbake igjen, men sånn det. En av hovedoverskriftene til PTMF, Power Threat Meaning Framework, det jo da what happened to, altså at spørsmålet blir what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you. Men en veldig sånn åpnende og fin inngang til konstruktive samtaler og konstruktive væren med mennesker som på en eller annen måte har sånn distress i livene sine. Da. Jeg har lyst til å ta et sitat som innledning til dette her, og det da forbløffende nok på engelsk, fordi det faktisk står på engelsk her. Og det bare lytt nøye etter, dette en sånn introduksjon også til engelsk da, for å si det sånn. Power Threat Meaning Framework da. The framework is based on a narrative model which understands human distress as emerging in relation to social contexts. Det gikk bra. Rather than considering behaviors, thoughts and emotions as symptoms of disorder, the PTMF considers them as intelligible, litt sånn rar uttale, men responsible to social and relational adversities and their cultural and ideological meanings. Det ligger en sånn fortettet informasjon i den setningen. Det også et sitat fra Lucy Johnstone. Lucy Johnstone, veldig sånn kort om hun også. Altså hun jo da, som det står, altså consultant clinical psychologist, og har da skrevet en masse bøker. Mange av disse her jo da litt sånn kritiske til altså disse mental helseperspektivene da. Bare si sånn lynkjøpt at her går det jo an å ha mange perspektiver med seg inn i denne samtalen. Det ene jo at Power Threat Meaning Framework faktisk et alternativ til diagnosesystemet. Det det. Parallelt så det også en alternativ tenkemåte som kan tenkes å supplere diagnosesystemet. Her går det an å ha en inngang til den samtalen rundt dette rammeverket fra liksom med mange forskjellige innganger. Man kan ha en radikal inngang og en langt mindre radikal inngang, og likevel få dette her til å gi mening. Da. Men et par av disse titlene som Lucy Johnstone har, altså boktitler, det ene er 'Foundation in Psychology and Psychotherapy'. Unnskyld, 'Formulation'. Altså det er rett og slett spørsmålsstilling in Psychology and Psychotherapy. Og en litt mer sånn talende titel som er 'Users and Abusers of Psychiatry, a critical look at psychiatric practice'. Så litt sånn med disse ord da, så har jeg den store ære av å få lov å ønske Lucy Johnstone velkommen opp på scenen. Og jeg er meget spent på det hun skal si, og også spent på hele denne dagen. Jeg tror dette her kan bli veldig interessant og veldig spennende. Så da sier jeg velkommen til Lucy Johnstone. Jeg regner med at hun også vil være i stand til å introdusere seg selv, også litt mer utfyllende enn det jeg har gjort nå. Ja, velkommen.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning. It's lovely to be here in your beautiful country. To be honest, it's nicer here than in the UK. I do love my country, but the UK is not in a good state at the moment. And it's particularly nice to be in this beautiful seaside town. I've already been swimming twice, and I've only been here since yesterday. So, thank you for the introduction. And I'm not very good with technology, but I think this is what I need to use. So, I'm here to talk about the Power Threat Meaning Framework. It's quite a long and complicated document, so today really I'm only going to be able to give you a flavour of it. I will point you towards resources and videos and podcasts if you're interested in looking further. It's also quite a controversial document, so the first thing I want to say is that these are optional ideas. Nobody has to agree with them or like them or put them into practice in any way. On the other hand, some of you are probably already thinking and practicing along these lines because the framework draws from a lot of existing good work. So I hope at the very least we can have a good discussion, and if you go away from today with something to think about, that will be good. We will have achieved our aim. So I will try not to speak too fast, even though I know you speak very good English, and I don't speak any Norwegian, I'm afraid. The only thing I can say is thank you. That's tack, is that right? So that's a start. So the timetable for today. So for the first hour, I'm going to put in the context of the framework, and the context is very much a UK context, which has some similarities, I think, with Norway, but also some differences. Then we'll have a break, then I'll do a brief overview of the main principles of the framework, and then we've got some talks, discussions, and final questions. Please do submit your questions throughout the talks. So this is my starting point for the context, the UK context. This is bad news. We've had a right-wing party in power for 13 years. They have created havoc. You may have seen in the news that Boris Johnson has just resigned as a member of Parliament, so that's good. Obviously, he should have resigned 5 years ago, but better late than never. But this government has left a trail of disaster. Income inequality, job insecurity, reduced welfare services, loss of family and community ties, financial insecurity. Every shop in the UK has a basket to collect food in for people who can't afford to buy food. Every street has homeless people on it. Materialist values, scapegoating of others such as migrants, silencing of protests, excluded social groups and communities, competition and individualism at the expense of community. That's not a good picture, is it? It's not a good picture. So, we also have these trends. I don't know whether your trends are similar or not. I think they're somewhat similar across the Western world, so I guess you may recognize some of this. We have a steep rise in diagnoses. Almost everybody appears to be eligible for a diagnosis of something: anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism. A lot of young people are self-diagnosing on social media. A lot of celebrities are saying, I have this mental illness. We have very long clinic waiting lists. We have a lot of prescribing. I think actually the figure is 1 in 4 people in the UK is taking a psychiatric drug of some kind. We have cognitive behavioural therapy rolled out as a solution, which doesn't actually seem to be working very well, and we have constant media headlines about mental health. This is not a coincidence. That's what I want to emphasise. These two things are not separate from each other. The one leads to the other, but you wouldn't think that the way people talk about it. Part of the purpose of the framework is to show really how those two things are linked. Okay, and that's part of the theme for today. And at the same time, there are some good things going on in the UK. So we have a long-standing tradition of critiques of psychiatry. We have clinical psychologists, not the majority, but quite a large minority, like myself, who are very critical of psychiatric practice. By psychiatric practice, I mean the whole of the mental health system and what goes in there. I don't just mean psychiatrists. We have a group of psychiatrists called the Critical Psychiatry Network who are very brave and outspoken. We don't need diagnosis necessarily for insurance. We have some alternatives to diagnosis, which I'm about to describe to you. We've had some successful campaigns about awareness of withdrawal effects from antidepressants and so on. We have trauma-informed practice, we have an active survivor movement, people who've been on the receiving end of psychiatric care, and the framework has achieved widespread publicity as well as a lot of opposition. Some of the opposition has really been quite nasty and unpleasant and very personal, but that is a sign that at least it's having an impact, I think. So what is the core question we need to think about? People's distress is very real. It's important to say that. Often being critical of diagnostic thinking is taken as disbelieving people's suffering. But of course people's distress is very real. By the way, you can all have the slides afterwards, so don't feel you have to read everything on every slide. I will read out the important bits and you can have them afterwards. So people of course feel very low or panicky or anxious or desperate. They have very real struggles. But the question is, are they suffering from medical illnesses of some kind which need diagnosing? We are actually questioning the explanations that we're offered. We're not questioning the very real experiences. So, this is the briefest possible overview of what is wrong with psychiatric diagnosis. One of the next speakers is going to go into this in more detail, so I'm going to say this very briefly. Now, what's interesting about these criticisms is they're coming from the heart of the establishment. So Dr. Alan Francis is the chair of the DSM-4 committee. He is actually one of the most powerful psychiatrists in the world, and he has said DSM-5, our current edition, which came out in 2013, will radically and recklessly expand the boundaries of psychiatry. There is no reason to believe the DSM-5 is safe or scientifically sound. That's pretty damning, isn't it? And here are some other very senior psychiatrists in America saying it's totally wrong, an absolute scientific nightmare. Patients deserve better. The weakness is its lack of validity. You can't have a bigger weakness than lack of validity. It's not actually describing anything in the real world. And in an interview, I wonder if he actually meant to say this, but Dr. Alan Francis said there is no definition of a mental disorder. I mean, you just can't define it. It's bullshit. You understand what bullshit means? Is there a Norwegian word? I'm sure there is. So this is strange in a way because the secret is out, yet many professionals don't know this. Certainly service users are not told this. So I've never yet come across a service user who was told, well, we could describe this as bipolar disorder, but actually you know that that label is bullshit. Anybody ever been told that? No. So it's kind of a secret that is not publicly admitted. And at the same time, we have reports at a very senior level, for example, the United Nations report in 2017 saying diagnostic tools do not have a solid scientific basis. We've been sold a myth that the best solutions for mental health challenges are medications and other biomedical interventions. And they made a number of recommendations, one of which was we should think about social determinants, what's going on in people's lives, not about the illnesses that supposedly come from within them. and we should address the power imbalance rather than the chemical balance. And if you wanted a single slogan to summarise the power threat meaning framework, it's about looking at the power imbalance, not the chemical imbalance, which would be good on a t-shirt, wouldn't it? Power imbalance, not chemical imbalance. Of course, we now know, thanks to the work of some British psychiatrists, that there is no such thing as a chemical imbalance that causes depression or psychosis or whatever. But again, it's something that's widely believed. So, summary of criticisms of psychiatric diagnosis, they're not what they claim to be. They're not actually based on medical research about what goes wrong in people's bodies, like diagnoses in general medicine are. They're ultimately based on social judgments about people's unusual or distressing ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. We can see that in the criteria in the diagnostic manuals. So people who receive a psychiatric diagnosis are almost certainly very distressed and in need of help, but this is not best understood as a medical problem. So we end up with this circular argument. Why does this person have delusions or feel so low? Because they have schizophrenia or depression. How do you know they have schizophrenia or depression? Because they have delusions or feel so low. So it's kind of circular, and you can do that with any diagnosis. Why does this person have such extreme mood swings? Because they have bipolar disorder. How do you know they have bipolar disorder? Because they have such extreme mood swings, and so on and so on. So the label doesn't explain anything, but of course it does have an impact. And the impact, one of the impacts, is of course often a sense of kind of stigma and shame. Whereas in medical diagnosis in general, you have an exit point. You say, your headache, well, we can look into it, we can do a scan, you know, it might be this, this, or this. We can rule out a brain tumour, for example. We don't have that exit from that circle in psychiatry. So one of the most damaging impacts, I would say, of this diagnostic model, which is actually not working at all well in Western societies, is that it's being exported across the globe to low-income and middle-income countries, who are said to be unfortunately deprived of our wonderful modern Western scientific psychiatric interventions. Actually, countries and cultures without this way of thinking have their own local healing practices, which often work on a narrative base, interestingly, and often work at a group level, and often are very effective in those particular cultures. Nevertheless, we are exporting our way of thinking along with a whole lot of pills. A lot of this is funded by the pharmaceutical companies, of course. So psychiatrists like Suman Fernando have argued this is simply another form of colonialism. That's quite a provocative thing to say, but actually I think there's some truth in it. We're not sending tanks and armies into these countries, but we are exporting a way of thinking which invades people's minds, if you like. Here is a psychiatrist saying Western psychiatry can certainly provide low and middle income countries with instructive examples, but they're mainly examples of what not to do. Okay, so if you want to read more, I'm going to do a few plugs as I go along. This is a short book that I wrote. Second edition came out last year. It's a very brief overview of the arguments for and against psychiatric diagnosis. It is, I hope, accessible and easy to read. I'm pretty sure PCCS books do send books to Norway if anyone's interested. And it's meant to be written so anyone can understand it, including people who may have been given a diagnosis and don't necessarily know much about the mental health field. I also did a podcast when I was in Oslo in November with one of the people from MAD in Norway, talking about the problems of diagnosis, if you want to look at that. So where do we end up? This is an extract from that book I've just shown you. Along with other westernized societies, we have less tolerance of distress, along with more reasons to be unhappy, increased medicalization of our feelings, just as the real life reasons for them seem more obvious. We have massively expanding markets for drugs accompanied by parallel rises in disability. We have damning criticisms of diagnosis, just as more people are adopting these labels, all accompanied by rapidly growing waiting lists for mental health services and ever louder calls for more funding in the absence of any solid evidence that they improve outcomes overall. In fact, despite the best intentions of mental health professionals, and I'm a mental health professional, I have been and am part of this system, services seem to be making things worse. That's not a very good summary, is it? It's not a very good picture. I don't know how much of that applies in Norway, but I suspect at least some of it does. How long will it take before we think we are doing something absolutely fundamentally wrong here? The answer is not more of the same, more clinics, more nurses, more doctors, more funding. The answer is to think about this completely differently. So, this is why the Division of Clinical Psychology, which is my professional body, it's part of the British Psychological Society, came out with this statement at the same time as DSM-5 was issued in May 2013. You don't need to read all those words, but essentially it is saying DSM-5 is deeply flawed. We need a paradigm shift. We need a complete shift towards a conceptual system that's not based on a disease model. That's an official position of the DCP. So I think that's a brave thing to say. As far as I know, we are the only professional body in the world that's come out and actually said this. Oh, interesting. Have you lost the picture now? Can you see it? Good. Okay. Thank you. Interesting. Somebody interfered at that crucial moment because it's very controversial. Don't read it. Somebody doesn't want you to read that. And indeed, not all psychologists agree with that. That caused an enormous amount of dispute and disagreement, but it's out there. So these are difficult discussions, and there are certainly going to be people in the audience who have themselves struggled with mental health problems, and people who are on some kind of psychiatric drug, which may well be helpful for you, and that's fine. This is about informed choice. It's not about saying no one should take psychiatric drugs. So these discussions are difficult, they're sensitive, they're complicated. And one of the things that happens when we discuss them is we tend to get into what we have called the brain or blame trap. Either it's my brain, it's my chemical imbalance, I can't help it, it's not my fault, someone's going to put me right, I don't have to feel guilty and ashamed, or it must be my fault, I must be weak, inadequate, to blame in some ways, I must have to feel very bad about myself. Now, if I thought those were the only two options, I would certainly want to go for the brain one. So I think it's very understandable that people often like these explanations, and also they are told this by experts, so of course they believe it. But actually, our argument is we need something in between brain or blame. We need something that shows how distress is understandable, real and understandable. It's certainly not an individual's personal fault and a sign of their inadequacy, nor is it simply something that's gone wrong in their brain. So we do have a number of ways of doing this. So in the UK, we have something which is called a formulation, which I don't think, I've travelled to quite a few other countries, and it's fairly new to most other countries. I don't think it's very well established in Norway. So a formulation, it's a fancy word really for a personal narrative or a story. It puts together two forms of evidence. First of all, the clinician brings their knowledge of the research and their clinical experience, and the client in the room brings an account of what's gone on in their lives and what sense they made of it and so on, and their life history. You put this together, you can come up with a shared evolving hypothesis. In a way, it's a very personal hypothesis, or in more informal language, best guess, a process of collaborative ongoing sense-making. And this can serve all the functions I think the diagnosis is meant to serve, but doesn't. So formulation is a very key part of all clinical psychology professionals, all clinical psychologists training in the UK, and all of us use it. So I'm going to give you an example. I've invented this example. It's a fairly typical example of someone who might end up in psychiatric services. Let's say Karen is 32. Her mother suffered from depression. Her father died when she was 8. The family had little money to live on. Her mother remarried. Karen was sexually abused by her stepfather from the ages of 11 to 14, but she didn't feel able to tell anyone. She struggled at school and had few friends. She left school and started working in a shop. She didn't get on with her manager and took sick leave. Alone in her flat, she started to hear a hostile and critical voice. Now, it's possible that Karen might be diagnosed with schizophrenia or psychosis. Or almost anything else, to be honest, bipolar disorder, personality disorder. These are all overlapping diagnoses, but suppose after she feels a bit more settled and calmer, Karen is able to sit down with a psychologist or sometimes another mental health professional and get to know them and trust them and talk through her life, and suppose they are able together to come up with something like this. So instead of the label of schizophrenia, I'll read this out in case you can't see it. You had a happy childhood until your father died when you were 8. As a child, you felt very responsible for your mother's happiness, and you pushed your own grief away. Later, your mother remarried, and when your stepfather started to abuse you, you did not feel able to tell anyone. You left home as soon as you could and got a job in a shop. However, you found it increasingly hard to deal with your boss, whose bullying reminded you of your stepfather. One day, you started to hear a male voice telling you were dirty and evil. This seemed to express how the abuse made you feel, and it also reminded you of the things that your stepfather had said to you. You found life increasingly difficult as past memories and feelings came to the surface. Despite this, you have many strengths, including intelligence, determination, and self-awareness, and you recognize the need to revisit some of the unresolved feelings from the past. So that's a formulation, an invented one. And it's not fixed, it will evolve, it will change as Karen and her therapist get to know each other. Ideally, if she's in hospital, it'll be shared with the team so everybody knows what's going on, everyone has the same view. So it seems to me that provides what diagnosis doesn't, i.e. an explanation. It's personal to Karen. It also draws on quite a lot about what we know about the impact of trauma and abuse. It's about what she can do as well as what she can't do. It's about her strengths in surviving, not just her difficulties and struggles. We hope it helps her to feel I've been listened to, I've been understood, and there can be a way forward. And it seems to me that if you say, and by the way, you've also got schizophrenia, it doesn't add anything, does it? What does that do? It doesn't add anything. You actually don't need a diagnosis if you have a formulation. And as a clinical psychologist, I have never, ever, ever in my entire professional career, which has been several decades, used diagnosis with people. I use formulation, and that's quite an accepted thing for psychologists to do, although I have to say some psychologists think formulation is an add-on to a diagnosis rather than a replacement, so it's a bit controversial. But however, we do have an alternative. And these are our good practice guidelines on how to do formulation in a way that's thoughtful and reflective and based on the evidence. They're free to download. I was the lead author for those, so obviously I agree with them. Very good guidelines those are. And it's a very respectable thing to say in the UK. If you say my practice is formulation-based, everybody thinks that's a good thing. So it's a way out of the brain or blame trap, because the central message of any formulation is you have survived very difficult circumstances in the best way you could at the time. These strategies are no longer needed or useful. With the right kind of support, you can learn to leave them behind. So every formulation comes down to that message in a way. And this is how I see it. The central task of all mental health professionals, whatever their background, is to create meaning out of chaos and despair. So that's formulation. That's one of the things that the framework builds on. As you will see, the Power Threat Meaning Framework was able to build on these traditions, and we hope take them further. Secondly, I think this will be familiar to you, is trauma-informed practice. I'm guessing most or all of you have come across trauma-informed practice, so I'll go through this quite briefly. Trauma-informed practice is also quite widely accepted in the UK, particularly in Scotland, but also in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. So very basically, you may already know this very well yourselves, the trauma-informed approach recognises that adversities of all types, bad things that happen to people, abuse, neglect, violence, discrimination, poverty, and so on, massively increase the chance of experiencing psychological or emotional distress, the things we call mental illnesses. And that actually, rather than seeing people as suffering from symptoms of an illness, we can perhaps see people as using ways of surviving, survival mechanisms that may have been essential at the time these events were happening, but sometimes these things become problematic in their own life. So we are dealing with people with problems, not patients with illnesses, the simplest way of putting it. And what do we mean by trauma or adversity? We mean lots of things. I won't go through all this. Neglect, physical abuse, psychological abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, as well as specific traumatic events and so on. So this is a very strongly research-based approach. Unlike almost the entirety of psychiatry, it's based on a very solid body of evidence, as I'm sure you know. We know this to be true. We know that adversities massively increase the risk of current and later distress. It's always nice when research backs up common sense, isn't it? It's common sense that people who have shit lives feel shit about themselves. Is that a fair way to put it? And a different way of putting it is, my practice is formulation-based and trauma-informed. Okay, nobody will disagree with that. Okay, so there are strong associations between trauma, however we define it, and all of these forms of what some people would call mental illness. So from a trauma-informed perspective, this is not a whole range of this illness, this disorder, this disorder, this disorder. This represents a range of overlapping ways that people struggle to survive with the experiences and memories of different kinds of trauma and adversity. So my understanding of trauma-informed approach is that they're not diagnostic. They're actually saying we don't need these artificial divisions. This is psychosis, this is personality disorder. They're saying the whole lot of this can be seen as, in a sense, trauma reactions. That's not true of absolutely everybody. We're going to come on to that, but it's true of a great many people. And trauma-informed practice also reminds us to look at the social context. So who are the people who are most likely to experience traumatic events? Well, it can happen to any of us, but deprived communities have higher levels of trauma, violence, and abuse, and consequently higher rates of mental and physical and health problems. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And if you do surveys showing how many people have up to 10 ACEs, you find that if in the bottom fifth of the population, in terms of economic resources, you get 4 or more ACEs you get 3 times more ACEs than in the top, the wealthier, the more privileged part of the population. So what this shows, I quite like this diagram, is that traumatic experiences and adversities are rooted in deprived environments. They're rooted in, if you look at the tree, the things like abuse and neglect and so on are the leaves of the tree, but the tree has roots. And the roots are in adverse community environments, in things like poverty and discrimination and exclusion and poor housing and violent neighborhoods and so on. So traumatic events don't come from nowhere. They shouldn't be thought about just at a personal, individual level, but as part of a whole society and what goes on in that society. So trauma-informed services recognise that the effects of complex trauma are pervasive. They're everywhere. If we don't resolve these, they can impact mental and physical health across the lifespan. We're talking about mental health today, but in some respects that's a kind of artificial decision because adverse childhood experiences also increase the likelihood of poor physical health, poor educational outcomes, and a whole range of other social and personal problems. The majority of people treated by public health, mental health and substance abuse services have trauma histories. Child abuse in all its forms and neglect are the key causal factors in complex trauma, but not the only ones. Services themselves can be re-traumatizing. This is a really, really important thing. Really important to acknowledge that if people come into services with trauma histories and don't get understood and don't get listened to and don't get the support they actually need, then not only are they not helped, they are often re-traumatized. A diagnosis can be experienced as re-traumatizing, as a message that it was my fault after all, there's something wrong with me. And all the things that go along with psychiatric interventions, of course, can be experienced as re-traumatizing. So when we don't resolve complex trauma, it causes ongoing problems. And of course, these problems are likely to be passed down the generations because however well-intentioned they are, parents and carers are not able to look after their children in the way they would like to if they themselves are suffering from unresolved trauma. So, instead of asking what's wrong with you, we need to ask what's happened to you. This slogan comes from the trauma-informed literature, Jackie Dillon is one of the contributors to the Power Threat Meaning Framework, and she has made this a very popular slogan. Again, that summons up the framework in a very neat way. One summary is, instead of chemical imbalances, power imbalances, and other summaries, instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what's happened to you. Now, some people like to misinterpret that. It doesn't mean you literally invite someone into the room, get your pen out, and say, what happened to you? Of course it doesn't. It means that is the area we need to explore. We're looking for a history, not kind of hunting for a label. Instead of diagnosing people, we need to listen to their stories, a simple but radical message in the context of the dominance of the biomedical model of emotional distress. Again, it seems to me this is obvious, this is common sense. We need to listen to people's stories. Any person in the street can tell you, well, it'd be good really to listen to what that person's life has been about and what it's been like. In the context of a diagnostic model, that's actually quite a controversial thing to say, because it threatens to expose the rest as actually mistaken and irrelevant and, at worst, damaging. So, I'm doing quite well in terms of time. I will stop for some questions in a minute, but I'm going to start to introduce the framework to you, the Power Threat Meaning Framework, and the framework builds on all of this work, but also takes it further. Okay, so the Power Threat Meaning Framework. It's a 5-year project. It was funded and published by the British Psychological Society. The main author group are the people in the top paragraph. I and Mary Boyle are clinical psychologists, and we are the lead authors, and the rest of the group are our main co-authors. Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longdon are both survivors of the psychiatric system. You may have heard of them. They have lots of talks on YouTube and so on. They're nationally and internationally known as campaigners and trainers and researchers. And as the project continued, we drew on a range of other people who also had expertise in particular areas. We ended up with a group of about 40 people. About 1/3 of them had experience of having received psychiatric care. So again, the framework is sometimes described as written by psychologists. Well, it's co-produced is the word we use in the UK, with survivors and professionals working alongside each other as equals. It's really important to say that it's co-produced. It's not another fancy idea dreamed up by professionals. Okay, and when we were having dinner last night, which was very nice, thank you for that very nice dinner, and thank you to the university for paying for it. Someone was asking, well, how did this all start? Because, I mean, I think sometimes people assume this was a plan. It wasn't a plan, it was an accident. So what happened was all of these people in the core author group have known each other for many years. I've known Mary for 30 years, possibly longer. And we all know each other very well because nearly everyone in the kind of broadly critical movement in the UK knows each other. It's all a little bit incestuous, I have to say. In a very good way. And so we happened to be at a conference at the same time in November 2012, and so we thought we'd get together and have a drink, and I had suggested we might want to spend some time thinking about what would a real alternative to psychiatric diagnostic thinking look like. We can spend a lot of time bashing against the doors of systems and organisations that won't change, writing articles that not many people read, all that kind of stuff, which we've all done throughout our careers. There comes a time when actually it's important to say, well, what do we do instead? And of course, there are already alternatives. There are a lot of alternatives out there, but we wanted something much bigger. We wanted an actual conceptual framework, a bit like where we have a medical model framework. Well, we want a completely different framework. And so 4 hours later, we were all still throwing ideas around and getting very excited and interrupting each other. So we thought, well, this sounds like an idea we're all interested in. We thought, let's start to put something on paper. And we initially thought, we'll do this without any interference. So we want to write exactly what we want. We don't want to have to say things we don't believe or tiptoe around things or all the rest of it. But it fairly quickly became evident we needed a bit of funding for a research assistant. We wanted to travel and have meetings together and go to conferences and so on. So we applied to the Division of Clinical Psychology for some funding. And because of their statement, which was essentially saying, in 2013, we need to move towards a different conceptual framework. They were willing to fund our effort to put that together. Now, the framework is not an official DCP or BPS model, but the atmosphere was right for us to be given this funding. I don't think it would happen nowadays. There happen to be some quite critically minded people at the top. So we started on this project, and I always say it's a bit like having children. I'm a mother. If you knew what it was going to involve, you'd never do it in the first place. But of course, nobody regrets having their lovely, lovely, lovely children. So we're very proud of the end product, but my God, it was a difficult journey getting there. And I think it wasn't until about 2.5 years into the project that we started to get a sense of where we were going, and which is kind of interesting, isn't it? All people have been thinking about this for years who've never believed in this diagnostic model in the first place. I never have believed in it. This isn't going to sound very unhealthy, but I started reading psychology books literally when I was 12, and I thought, I don't believe this diagnostic stuff. Okay, make of that what you will. Come up with whatever formulation you like. Anyway, it was actually very difficult because this way of thinking, even if you officially disagree with it, finds its way into your head, it finds its way into your mind. And we had a lot of very intense discussions. We're all still good friends, so that's good. And about 3 years in, the shape of it started to emerge, and 5 years later, we emerged the other end with a massive, massive document. So it's translated into Norwegian, which is fantastic. So this is the Norwegian version. It's actually the shorter of the two documents. So this is the overview document, which is the framework itself. There is a longer document not available in Norwegian, but all of this stuff is available on the website. That's the link. It's for free. We wanted this to be free knowledge. This is about giving everyone the opportunity to have access to different ideas. So both documents are available on the website for free. The main document is 200,000 words long. That's 2 PhDs. And that's part of the reason it took us 5 years to produce, because we really wanted to produce something that was as solidly evidence-based as possible, because we knew people would be saying, this is nonsense, why are you saying this, how can you back this up? So we did a massive overview of all the biological, social and psychological evidence that there is. I think it's worth saying that we also cast quite a critical eye on what we mean by evidence, because what counts as evidence, of course, is not neutral and objective. We are told this is something that's evidence-based, represents the objective scientific facts, but who decides that, who publishes it, who disseminates it, who interprets it, who funds it? Actually, the idea of what counts as evidence often serves to silence the most important form of evidence, which is what people say about their lives and what people say about their experience of the psychiatric system. So we've got that as an equally important form of evidence as well, what people actually say. Okay, and astonishingly enough, it's taken off beyond our wildest dreams. So it'd be nice to think that's just because it's such an important document. I think what it actually says is a great many people are saying this isn't working, we really need something different. We really need something different. They're saying that kind of worldwide in a way. So that's the very short version. The document itself is written at a very broad level. It's a set of principles. It does not say, in this setting or in this situation, do this. This is how you run your team. This is how you do your therapy. This is how you do your formulation. It doesn't say that. We very, very much wanted the ideas to be out there, but people in their particular settings to describe to think about what will work best in their own particular settings. So if any of you are interested in what we're discussing today and want to try these ideas out in your own setting, let us know, get in touch with the website. We have examples of people putting into practice. That would be fantastic. So the first stage, if you like, is the stage building up to publication. The second ongoing stage is, now we have these ideas out here, now anyone who's interested can be involved in evaluating this, trying it out in their own setting, saying this seems to work here, this doesn't seem to work so well here, perhaps we need more of this, perhaps we need less of this, and so on. So it doesn't tell you how to do it. This is the nearest thing to how to use the framework. This is a short book. Again, I'm pretty sure you can buy that online and get it shipped to Norway. I have 4 copies for sale for lucky people who rush forward. waving money at me. So what this does is take you through the core questions of the Power Threat Meaning Framework. It's sort of a self-help book in a way, because the framework is not meant to be just about working in clinical settings, or that's probably what we'll focus on today. So if any of you want to think about distress in your own life, or the life of a friend or family or partner, this book would help you. But equally, if you want to think about how you might use these ideas with someone you're working with or supporting, it takes you through it in quite a simple way with examples. So it's an alternative to the diagnostic model of distress and unusual experiences. Now, in English, the word alternative is has a slightly ambiguous meaning. It can just mean you could do this, or you could do this. You could use diagnosis, or you could use the framework. So at a purely practical level, and I'm going to show you some examples, we live in a diagnostically based system. The framework, it's not going to collapse overnight. If you do use the framework, you're probably going to be using it as an alternative in that sense. We have a lot of diagnostic practice. We still need those terms for some purposes, but we can also offer people this as something different if they're interested. What our intention is that it should be an alternative in the sense of replacement for. Okay, one day the diagnostic model will crumble. I'm 100% certain of it, and I might not be around to see that happen, but I'm 100% certain that it will happen, that it is happening. I think this is why we're seeing the controversies. This is why the debates are coming to the surface. This is why I get so much abuse on social media. It's because actually things are shifting in ways that are quite difficult for some people to take on board. It's not a replacement for all current models. All of you will be involved in good practice already, I'm sure. We have some appendices at the end of the overview, the shorter document, and they give examples of good practice that we think the framework is very compatible with, one of which is open dialogue. That will be a familiar name to most, if not all of you, won't it? So we think open dialogue fits very well with the Power Threat Meaning Framework. A lot of excellent work going on there. We're going to discuss that. We also think trauma-informed practice fits very well with the framework. But it also suggests new ways forward, currently being translated in all those languages. So trauma-informed practice, as I said, these two approaches are very compatible. There's a lot of the trauma-informed practice research in the document. But it's more than trauma-informed practice, because it also puts an emphasis on things that I think trauma-informed practice often doesn't place enough focus on. This is wider structural factors, wider economic pressures, wider considerations about our societies are actually run and on what assumptions they're based. Things like inequality, social exclusion, discrimination, colonization, giving people devalued identities. So it's taking trauma-informed practice a way further in a way, and by doing that you can also show that there are reasons that people may feel distressed that are not related to obvious trauma. They may have had comfortable lives, they may have loving families, they may have enough money to live on. As we know, patterns of distress are rising, particularly in young people, despite all that. And if you look at those wider factors, the expectations we're all supposed to be meeting, the inequalities, the injustices of our society, the way we put overemphasis on achievement, on lifestyle, on appearance, on all sorts of things, you can easily understand, I think, why people might feel extremely distressed, even if they are relatively fortunate in life. We avoid diagnostic language, so trauma-informed language does sometimes retain words like disorder, which we don't, and we show, we hope, links to wider institutional organisational contexts, as I said there. So another very simple way of summarising the framework, instead of diagnoses, we use narratives. Now, a formulation is a particular form of narrative, but narrative itself is a much bigger category. We're really, really keen that this isn't just about formulation. I've spent most of my career writing about, researching into, training in, teaching, using formulation. And it works very well in services. But actually, we need to look more broadly than that. It's a culturally specific way of addressing particular problems in Western services, I think. But as human beings, we are all storytellers and meaning makers. And narratives of personal stories of all kinds can be healing. So this might be art, music, dance, poetry, drama. In cultures that don't have Western diagnostic systems, people frequently will create stories together as a social group or a family group. So the framework is about all those kinds of narratives. And that means that it's about all of us. We do not recognize two separate groups of people, mentally ill, mentally disordered, and normal people. All of us struggle with life at times. All of us have to find the best way of surviving. And the framework is actually about all our lives and all of us. So, thank you, because you've all been very good and quiet. I've managed to get through that quite quickly, and we now have about a quarter of an hour for questions, if anyone has questions. But perhaps we can save questions about the framework for later, because you haven't heard about all the exciting things I'm going to tell you about the framework yet. But if there are questions about other aspects of what I've just said, we could take them now.
I have some questions, Lucy.
Good.
How can we free ourselves from the dependence of diagnosis?
Goodness, how can we free ourselves from the dependence of diagnosis? That's a big one. Well, lots and lots of different ways, I suppose, is the only answer, isn't it? I guess from the framework point of view, the first and most fundamental way we can free ourselves is by having a different way of thinking. It's hard to overemphasize how deeply this way of thinking has got into our brains. You know, every media article talks about this person has bipolar disorder or something, and even the term mental health, I think, is very doubtful. Things that we used to talk about as feelings now become mental health problems. So we need to be fundamentally thinking in a different way, and that means all of us. It means journalists, it means ordinary people who are fed all this stuff through the media. It means watching our language. What we often say is the simplest thing you can do is watch your language. Be very careful about using words like illness, disorder, and so on. And how do we move forward? It depends very much on your setting, of course, and whatever setting you're in. You might only be able to make small steps, but each small step counts as another step towards a different future. At a bigger level, as I said, I do believe the whole system is crumbling. It's showing the signs of a conceptual framework that's under threat. And I don't know if you've read any of the work about paradigm shifts by Thomas Kuhn. He's a philosopher who talked about what happens when there's a major shift between one way of thinking that's completely taken over people's minds to another very different way of thinking that actually doesn't go together. He says there's a huge amount of uproar and debate and trying to kind of add bits onto the existing framework so it works. And actually, he says, what works in the end is, in some senses, a new generation comes along. So there's that famous saying, science progresses one funeral at a time. Have you heard of that? So basically, we have to outlive the people who are currently most committed to diagnostic practice. It's happening. We can all do a small amount to help it on its way, is the best answer I can give, I think.
New question, all about power imbalance.
Yeah.
My experience of the Norwegian mental health care system is that it's riddled with systemic failures. How do we get our employers to change their system? Okay,
I mean, big questions. I completely agree that, on the whole, mental health systems cause far more damage than they heal. And that is really not the personal fault of any mental health practitioner. Everybody goes into these jobs because they genuinely want to help people. They are often stressful, undervalued, low-paid jobs. But the whole thing adds up to something that is damaging. And I suppose, in a way, it's a bit like the first answer. The organisation itself has taken on this way of thinking. You can see that in every aspect, can't you? We have hospitals. Why do we have hospitals if these are not medical illnesses? We have loads of nurses, and doctors, and lots of medical thinking. Why do we have that if it's not fundamentally about illnesses, which it isn't? We have pills as the main intervention. Why do we have that if it's not fundamentally about mental illness, even though I think some medication has a role? So, I guess one answer to that is to show examples of organisations that are doing it differently. I'm going to show you an example towards the end of my talk of a very large, we call it a trust in the UK. It's an area of London which is covered by 14 inpatient wards where they've started to take on the framework, and they're doing it very differently. So one small suggestion is, if you're in an organisation that needs to change, if you can point to an example and say, look, this has been evaluated, this works, then it helps to get change on the agenda. The other thing I often say is it's very respectable to talk about trauma-informed practice. If you want a step forward, tell your organisation it needs to be trauma-informed, work with people who are promoting that message, because that will take you quite a long way towards where you need to be, in my view.